I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'll start off and I'll just say congratulations for being in the final 12. My name is Susan Firestone. I'm a retired patent and trademark attorney from Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Miles from Birmingham, Alabama. Obviously, Katie has brought Susan and me back for some remedial judge training, and we'll be glad to take any guidance, Katie, that you can give us. We saw your team the other day, and they were wonderful. Congratulations on having to do this for a third day, because we're really glad to see you again. Y'all were great the other day, and y'all got this knocked, so it's going to be fun to watch you today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
Okay, and introduce yourselves, please.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Jafet Pasham. We are Unit 3, and our unit focuses on how the Constitution has furthered the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. My name is Jafet Pasham, and I'll be studying finance at Indiana University.
Good afternoon. My name is Evelyn Marchand, and I'll be studying political science at Bates College.
Good afternoon, judges. My name is Caroline Pagliaro, and I will be studying biology and pre-physician assistant studies at the University of Pittsburgh.
Good afternoon. My name is Tahari Koda, and I'll be studying mechanical engineering at the Georgia Institute of Technology. But for now, we're all seniors at Trumbull High School, and this is our coach, Ms. Boland. We thank you all for being here today.
Thank you. And I'm sure you've heard by now, this is going to be question number 1. The right to vote was not expressly included in the U.S. Constitution of 1787. In your opinion, was the implied right to vote in the Constitution sufficient for the creation of a representative democracy? How did the expansion of voting rights affect the evolution of democracy in our country? Please give examples. Which is the greater threat to democracy, disenfranchisement or fraud? Explain your position and you may begin.
In 1776, 56 men signed a document that said that all governments must derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Decades later, the Constitution began with the phrase, "we the people," and yet voting was a privilege. The right to vote was not explicitly stated within the body of our Constitution.
While the original Constitution failed to explicitly recognize individual voting rights, there was an implied right that was sufficient for the creation of a representative democracy. Article 1, Section 2 states, "The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states."
Likewise, Article 2, Section 1 implied the direct involvement of the people in the selection of the president. It did so by providing the framework for the Electoral College, using chosen electors in a manner directed by each state's respective legislatures to select a president.
However, not all people were eligible to vote at the time of ratification. Article 1, Section 2 made the qualifications for voting in U.S. House elections the same for those voting in the larger branch of state legislatures. This effectively excluded Native Americans, African Americans, and women. It also excluded some white men due to property ownership requirements that were the norm in 1787.
Much has changed since then. Almost a third of the amendments added to the Constitution after the Bill of Rights concerned voting rights. The 15th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th amendments granted voting rights to African Americans, women, the citizens of the District of Columbia, the socioeconomically disadvantaged, and people who are old enough to fight for our freedom. The passage of each of these amendments represented a shift towards making voting a right of all citizens. But Jim Crow America prevented many people from getting to the polls, and more was needed to ensure all had access to the very essence of our democracy, voting.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a necessary measure in ensuring that the United States government was legitimately derived from the consent of the government. The Act banned the use of literacy tests, provided federal oversight for voter registration, and authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections.
In 2013, the Supreme Court, according to late Representative John Lewis, stuck a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act with their decision in Shelby County versus Holder. Over the next few years, half of the United States enacted restrictions on how people voted, polling places closed, and the lines at polls increased, with Black and Latino voters waiting 45 minutes more than their white counterparts.
Politicians have repeatedly and falsely claimed that the last 3 elections were marred by large numbers of people voting illegally. However, extensive research from the Brennan Center reveals voter fraud and impersonation are exaggerated, and many instances of alleged fraud are mistakes by voters or administrators.
Politicians have used fraud as an excuse to enact the new voter suppression laws since the Shelby decision. We believe that a nation's fear of voter fraud has catalyzed voter disenfranchisement. the graver threat to our American democracy. Felony disenfranchisement, early voting rollbacks, stricter photo ID laws, and polling place closures have all effectively blocked many Americans from our polls today.
In July of 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a request that cleared the way for thousands of Florida residents who had previously been convicted of a felony to vote in the state's upcoming election. In her dissent, Justice Sotomayor said, the court's inaction continues a trend towards condoning disenfranchisement.
Voting is one of the most basic rights in our democracy, yet so many people are locked out of the process. The For the People Act would dramatically strengthen our democracy, making it easier to vote, ending gerrymandering, fixing campaign finance system, and more.
It is time for Congress to pass this act and ensure that all Americans have equal access to the ballot box.
Thank you. We are now ready for your questions.
Yeah, take you up on the idea of gerrymandering. Do you think there's an advantage to gerrymandering?
I think historically we have seen some advantages to gerrymandering. We saw in the 1960s, before Shaw versus Reno, a lot of affirmative gerrymandering happening. Certain counties, especially Republican Party, to increase their political strength would allow for minorities, such as African Americans, to take large majorities in certain urban areas. And by packing them into these urban areas, they let African American Democrats win those seats in Congress. So although in the end, Republicans would end up gaining more seats, it also allowed for a lot of African Americans to get representation in Congress. So although this was eventually outlawed due to the partisan politics involved in it, it still allowed for a lot of representation for minorities, which allowed for us to get better representation in Congress.
I disagree with my colleague, as with the Baker v. versus Carr decision, they said that there should be one person and one vote. I think this is a better equal representation of our people in voting in our country.
In addition to Evelyn's point, following this decision in Baker versus Carr, we've seen the precedent set on each state that they must redraw their lines every so years to ensure that each citizen's voice is heard in a correct manner. And for example, we've even seen this in our own town, and we've seen citizens become involved in our districting lines with a grassroots called Trumbull Citizens for 7 districts. And we've seen citizens become involved in our own drawing of our district lines, which proves that citizens' voices are crucial to become involved in our politics and government.
Thank you.
Judge, you want me to go? So you want to go next, Judge? I don't care.
No, you can go ahead, Mike.
Okay. A nearby state of yours passed a law recently, New York, passed a law allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. A, is that a good idea or a bad idea? And B, if it's a good idea, is it how far up the chain of elections, local, state, federal, should that privilege be granted?
For the first 150 years of our country, over 40 states had guaranteed the right to vote for non-citizens. And that was because we didn't really have citizenship laws. But today we can see that 14 municipalities across the United States offer voting for non-citizens in their local elections. So we can, right now, we can strive to implement local election voting for our non-citizens and all our citizens, as they provide for their community, as they provide for all of us around, and they have the right to elect their own officials and their own government officials.
I definitely agree with Bed's point. And even if we look to the founding of our nation, we chanted no taxation without representation. And I think this slogan can definitely be applied to non-citizens living in New York, for example. And because they are paying taxes and they're sending their children to public schools and contributing to their education, I think it's crucial that they have a voice in their local elections so they can directly become involved in what legislature applies to them, and for their children, which public education legislation will be impact their education and therefore their future later on.
If we look at our Constitution and historical Supreme Court presidents, we see that the citizenship has little to no relation with voting. We see in United States versus Reese that the court decided that citizenship does not confer voting. And following that, we saw Minor versus Happerset, where they said that, again, even though women were equal citizens to men, they did not have the same rights to vote as men would. And that was only until the 19th Amendment that women gained these rights. So even though non-citizens do not have citizenship, that does not mean that they necessarily do not have to need that right to vote, because the two are not related. You can have voting without citizenship. And as we saw in the court deciding in the past, you can have citizenship without being able to vote. So I think the two cannot be put together.
Do not be compared. That's very interesting. That's a good answer, Judge.
Can you tell us what the Supreme Court has decided about partisan gerrymandering and what the effect of that decision has been?
We've seen the Supreme Court in 2019 decided in Rucho versus Common Cause that partisan gerrymandering is not actually a decision that the court can rule upon, and therefore is still legal and constitutional. And we've seen disastrous effects in Pennsylvania in 2010 or 2010. We saw Obama win 52% of the popular vote. The House congressional Democrats win 51% of the House votes, but Democratic Party candidates only won 28% of the seats. So there's just such a huge gap between what actually happened and the actual results.
We also saw in Shaw versus Reno, they forbid gerrymandering based on race. However, I think that partisan gerrymandering, as we've seen in this past year, has also kind of been manipulated with in race. Recently in Texas, they redistricted based off the new census. However, the redistricting did not properly represent the Latino population as well as the African American population that had recently moved to the area within the census. This was under partisan gerrymandering. However, it really didn't accurately represent the people.
Thank you. There's a lot of people, you talked about disenfranchisement. There are a lot of people that have the franchise to vote. They're registered voters, but they don't at the poll. Do you have any explanation for why, and maybe a solution if that's a problem?
Do you mind repeating your question again?
Sure, because I probably didn't come out very well. A lot of people are registered voters, but they don't bother to vote. Do you have any explanation of why that might be, or solution if it is a problem? Because maybe it's not a problem.
I think one of the biggest things why people are not going out to vote and why they can't vote is because of where they are economically. We should have a national election day, or maybe push it to a weekend election day. A lot of minorities are being underrepresented because they cannot go out on a random Wednesday or Tuesday to go out to vote, and they're losing money, and they have to go to work. They're losing money, and so they can't go out and cast their ballot because of the fact that the work requires them to come in. And we can see with countries like Belgium, Sweden, and Australia, who all have weekend elections or election days as a holiday, all have greater voter turnouts than the United States. So if we push that law to have election day as a national holiday or a weekend election, we can see a greater number of voter turnouts.
In addition to that, I think many citizens do not trust the candidates who are actually running for office. For example, following the citizens or FEC versus United States decision, we've seen that money plays a huge factor in politics, and 97% of citizens actually believe that politicians will appeal to donors rather than the actual demands of the citizens. So because there is this mistrust in our government, citizens do not have the desire to go out because they feel that their voices, once they are exercising it, they do not feel that it will be accurately heard once they do elect people into power.
I agree with Caroline. I think there is a mistrust in our government, as we saw with the recent case with Pamela Moses. She was an ex-felon who was still trying to regain her right to vote. And when she went to the court, they said she was cleared to vote. However, when she did vote, the paperwork had gotten messed up and she actually wasn't able to. This resulted in her being sentenced to almost 6 years in prison. Where, as we see with other cases of fraud, such as with a man in Colorado who registered under his dead wife's name, he only got a few days in prison. So I think that the different rules and just kind of like fear of being like prosecuted because you were trying to exercise your right makes people hesitant to go to the polls.
Did you say that last example was Colorado? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's because the judges in Colorado are so much more lenient and understanding. That's why Judge Talbot is a judge in Colorado. That's why I was pointing that out. I judged with a man one day who said the Constitution, he was a military veteran, and owned a business there in the state where we were judging, and he said the Constitution did not give me the right to vote. I'm a resident of this country. I pay taxes. I obey the laws. I have a right to pick the leaders. And if the Constitution or any other document gave that to me, they could take it away. So I was born with it. It's a fundamental right, and it's not because some document gave it to me. Was he way off the mark?
I don't think he was off the mark at all. I think that even though the Constitution didn't specifically imply or guarantee the right to vote, it was still implied, and the right to vote could be applied to you have your voice in government, and you have a voice that needs to be heard. And I think that in saying and electing your own officials, you are exercising that free right that you have as an individual. So even though the Constitution did not specifically state it, they still implied it.
I see what my colleague Ved is saying. However, I think the founders would have disagreed with him, as they saw voting as a political right that should be left up to the states and not in a federal in the Constitution or up to the federal government.
In addition, we've seen following Shelby County versus Holder how
Do you mind? Is it all right? Go ahead, Evan.
Yes.
Carolina, go ahead.
Sure, briefly.
Quickly.
Following this decision, it has been left up to the states, and whether to set a precedent for promoting voting, or however in turn we've seen loopholes to suppress the vote. That is when it's become an issue of the states with this implied right to vote.
Thank you.
Good job.
So much. Great job. I'd like to congratulate you and then turn it over to the judges to give you some feedback. Thank you.
It's because we're judges and we're never completely done. We'll go to the real judge. Judge Taubman, you want to start?
There you go. There you go. You lenient judge, Colorado.
I think you did a really nice job. I liked that you mentioned constitutional provisions that formed the basis for the implied right to vote, and that you cited the constitutional amendments dealing with voting. That was good. And I like when you were describing gerrymandering in response to a question that you mentioned, packing, about how African Americans could be put in one district to increase their representation in Congress. I was interested to hear that you said for 150 years, some states had allowed non-citizens to vote. We haven't heard that. I was not aware of that. I was glad that you were able to cite the Rucha case and Shaw v. Reno when you were talking about gerrymandering and one person, one vote. When you were talking about low voting, you had some good examples from Australia, and then some good suggestions, like saying that there could be a weekend elections on weekends, or an election holiday. You might have mentioned mail-in voting, which Colorado has and some other states have, which have had the effect of tremendously increasing the number of eligible voters who are voting, and doesn't require either a holiday or weekend election day when you have that as an alternative. And you get brownie points from Mike for citing the Shelby County case. So nice job, congratulations.
Judge, what did you tell us the turnout percentage was in Colorado?
It was over 90% of the eligible voters.
Over 90%. We've never had 90% in a local tax referendum anywhere in Alabama. That's astonishing. I wish everybody would do that. Yeah, over 90-something%. She's asking me, did he really say that? Yes, he did. Yeah, thanks a lot. You got another shot at Shelby v. Holder on the old guy from Alabama, and you didn't miss a chance. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I got to tell you something. Ordinarily, when I'm giving feedback, Susan, I look down at what I wrote while they're talking, things I agree with, things I didn't. Not that things, if I didn't agree with them, didn't mean it wasn't right. I didn't write anything down because you were moving. I looked to see what I wanted to say to you off that, and I didn't write anything. You were moving so quick and covering so many things. And yes, Judge, they were saying a few things we had not heard today. Sometimes when you reel off a bunch of cases, I want to go to the breakout room where Marcy sends us and say, that was interesting, Judge, but were they right? And if they weren't, he would probably have told you. What I wish is that, I said this a few minutes ago to somebody else, and you deserve to have it said to you. I wish that every student in the United States could have a civic education class like the one you just took and have a teacher like Katie Boland. And if you did, we wouldn't need near as many laws and near as many rules and near as many things to get around discriminating against each other. And the whole world would be a better place, and we'd all vote over 90%. I believe we would. Y'all did great today. You know that. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. I also enjoyed our time together with our dialogue that we had. You had a good introductory where you actually started with 1776, which was fun. And you brought us all the way from there into modern day, including you cited something from July 2020, a case that with Sonia Sotomayor's dissent. I enjoy the fact you mentioned this as being our basic rights to vote. But your discussion with us, the question and answer, was very enjoyable. And I just second my fellow judges, and I can't say enough that it was enjoyable. So job well done, and thank you very much.
Thank you all.